Hello and good evening. I'm Khalis Kadir. You are watching Pantau Agenda Reformasi. We are coming to you from Langkawi, Kedah, where the 18th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on the Environment, or AMME 18, is taking place. So we turn our focus to the region's environmental priorities and the role of international cooperation. This gathering brings together regional and international leaders to discuss urgent climate and environmental challenges facing our world today. And I'm honored to be joined by His Excellency Wopke Hoekstra, the European Commissioner for Climate, Net Zero and Clean Growth. Thank you, Commissioner, for taking your time and to speak with us today. So as we all know, ASEAN countries are among the most climate vulnerable, while the EU positions itself as a global leader in green transition. So how can ASEAN and the EU move from dialogue to concrete joint projects that bring a real impact on the ground? His Excellency.
You're absolutely right. The ASEAN region is very vulnerable, but make no mistake, the same is true for Europe. If you look at what is happening at a global scale, you see that the world is heating up by roughly 1.5 degrees already, but Europe is at double that number. So we're talking about 3 degrees, with huge ramifications all across the European Union, but particularly in our southern member states. So we do need to join forces, and that is exactly what we're doing in the domain of carbon pricing and carbon credits, in the domain of learnings on adaptation, hugely important because mitigation alone is not enough. And increasingly we're also teaming up to shape global climate diplomacy. We're going to have the COP in Brazil in just a couple of weeks, and we're adamant to make sure that our joint voice is going to be heard over there as well.
Before we move on to the question of financing the transition, I recall something. I'm just reminded of what you said 2 years ago. We acknowledged that Europe is only responsible for 7% of global emissions, and 93% takes place outside of EU. So if we don't want to stop the boiling of the planet, we need to look at ourselves. I was struck by a phrase you used back in 2023, the boiling of the planet. At the time, you also pointed out that Europe accounts for only about 7%, as I said before. So happening outside the EU, how can what say you about this term that you used before?
Well, that's right, but actually our relative share has further decreased. So if you take the current number, it went down from 7% to 6%. So 6% of all the emissions the world is creating are generated in Europe. The 94% are generated outside of Europe. But what you do need to understand is that climate change truly is a global phenomenon. So it doesn't matter where stuff is being pumped into the air. If it happens somewhere else, you're still at the receiving end of climate change. So it's a necessity that as an international community we do work together and we drive down emissions all over the world, because that's the only way to make sure we get out of harm's way.
Your Excellency, one of the consistent themes we hear across ASEAN is the struggle to secure and affordable climate financing. Southeast Asia is among the regions most vulnerable to climate shocks. Yet adaptation projects, which are critical for protecting communities, often receive far less attention and funding compared to mitigation efforts like renewable energy. The gap is enormous. According to the ASEAN Development Bank, ASEAN needs hundreds of billions of dollars annually in climate investment, but current flows fall far short of this. So many developing countries argue that international partners, especially advanced economies, should do more to ensure finance is not just accessible but also affordable, predictable and tailored to local needs. So one of the biggest challenges in Southeast Asia is access to affordable climate financing. So how can the EU help bridge the financing gap, especially for adaptation projects that often receive less attention compared to mitigation?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's actually two sets of problems that are interlinked. One is indeed the financing, and the European Union is doing, frankly speaking, more than its fair share. If you would look at the total amount that the world is spending and the aid that we're managing to bring to the table, out of 100 billion, Europe is doing roughly 30 billion, which is a very significant amount. And we're doing that, for example, through green financing arrangements that are part of the Asian Development Bank. But there are also many bilateral ways where we're currently doing that. So more is needed, but we will continue to make sure that we practice what we preach and that we invest and help here in the region as well. Secondly, adaptation, in my view, is an underdeveloped area basically across continents. What is true here in your beautiful part of the planet is also true in Europe. We have not done enough in terms of mitigation, and therefore more in terms of adaptation is needed, just to make sure that we survive. So we need to step up, we need to join forces and make sure that mitigation is basically matched also by adaptation.
Many ASEAN economies are still developing and heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So how can the EU support ASEAN in balancing economic growth with the urgency of cutting emissions without creating trade friction or widening inequality?
So one of our lessons is that economic growth and decarbonization actually can go hand in hand. If you were to take the European numbers, you would find that in the same time where we managed to grow our economy by 70%, we managed to reduce our emissions by 1/3. It's not always easy, but particularly with the technologies and the costs of these technologies, the ever lower costs of these technologies, there is a huge business opportunity for decarbonization as well. Just think about the cost curve of solar. Think about the huge potential of wind. Think about geothermal. There's truly much more possible than what we have done so far, and it gets ever cheaper.
Yeah, that's a striking observation, Commissioner, and one that deserves to be highlighted, I guess. Yeah? Right. So we move to the EU's deforestation regulation. EUDR has raised serious concerns in Malaysia and Indonesia, especially for smallholders. Is Brussels prepared to adjust or delay implementation if ASEAN producers cannot comply in time?
So this is more the domain of one of my colleagues in the Commission, but what I can say is that, you know, for all these topics, the solution is important, but it is equally important that we make sure we deal with these topics in the true spirit of partnership and come up with solutions that work for everyone. And I think that is one of the lessons we have also learned and that we bring to the table going forward, making sure we do these type of things in close dialogue with our friends and partners in ASEAN.
Another recurring crisis in our region is transboundary haze. For decades, it has been a thorn in ASEAN side, because it not only has an economic losses, but also testing the credibility of regional cooperation. ASEAN has its agreement on transboundary haze pollution, but enforcement remains largely voluntary, leaving accountability gaps unresolved. Transboundary haze has been ASEAN's recurring environmental crisis for decades. How far is EU willing to push accountability mechanism instead of leaving it as a voluntary cooperation issues?
Yeah, so in general, and that in my view is true for almost any policy area, only if it is clear what you're doing, if it is clear where there's potentially a gap, if you get feedback about what works and what doesn't work, you can improve. I've always been a huge advocate for transparency and for monitoring progress. Feedback is not always nice to get, but it's the only way and the best way to then actually improve.
That is a very compelling response, His Excellency. And then after the break, we will continue exploring the future of ASEAN-EU climate cooperation, including carbon markets and the road to COP30 in Brazil. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. You are still watching Pantau Agenda Reformasi. So we move to the next question. One of the interesting areas of cooperation between ASEAN and the EU lies in the field of carbon markets. So ASEAN is actively studying the idea of establishing a regional carbon market through progress from country to country. The EU, meanwhile, has developed one of the world's most established emission trading system, the EU ETS, which is often seen as a global benchmark. The question now is whether these two regions can eventually align their systems or at least create some form. Well, do you see scope of for linking or aligning ASEAN's carbon initiative with the EU ETS in the future?
This truly is an area where the sky is the limit, and it is fantastic to see that our friends and partners in ASEAN are embarking on this and are seeing the potential of this. One of the most effective things humanity can do is basically put a price to carbon. It's a market-based mechanism. It has worked phenomenally well in Europe, and it gets traction all over the world. Here in your beautiful part of the globe, but also in Latin America and elsewhere in Asia. So we're very much looking forward to further develop this, and this was a very significant part of the conversation here with the various ministers as well.
I think that's a quote worth remembering. It really frames the issue a powerful way. So with COP30 in Brazil approaching, what specific role do you expect ASEAN and the EU to play together in shaping a more ambitious global climate deal?
Well, in general, I feel a huge sense of gratitude for the conference that we're having here. It's true partnership, and it is true ambition in the domain of climate action. And Brazil provides us, or the COP in Brazil provides us with an excellent opportunity to bring that into practice. There are very few problems as complicated as climate action in a geopolitical time frame that is hugely complex, and yet we don't have a choice. We do need to work together. So the strong fundamentals between ASEAN and the European Union provide us with a stepping stone for ever more climate diplomacy also at the COP in Brazil.
Some in this region feel that Europe is asking ASEAN to go green, while historically the West contributed most to the global emissions. How do you respond to accusations of climate double standards?
I would not agree with it. What I do agree with is that with affluence comes responsibility, and the responsibility to make sure you fast forward the transition at home, and responsibility to help out friends and partners across the globe. And that is exactly what the European Union is doing. We have managed to drive down our own emissions very significantly. And by 2030 we will have reduced our emissions by 55% compared to the 1999 level. At the same time, we're helping out our friends and partners with financing, with best practices, with information sharing, with companies that are teaming up. And I think that is precisely what we should be doing.
One of the highlights of this ASEAN ministerial meeting on the environment, or AMME, is the involvement of youth. Across Southeast Asia, young people have been at the forefront of climate activism. So from grassroots campaigns to innovative startups that push for a greener solutions, their voices often bring urgency, creativity, accountability to policymakers. From the EU's perspective, why is it critical to bring in younger voices into the climate conversation?
Because it's the younger generation that has most longevity, right? They're gonna be on this earth longer than the older generations. So they have a huge interest to make sure this problem is not further getting out of hand, but is being dealt with effectively. And that is why I always like to bring the young generation and the next generation into the conversation.
Beyond regulations, how can the EU concretely support ASEAN in terms of green finance and technology transfer?
What it all boils down to is a sense of partnership and joining forces. And it is about regulation then indeed, that we should jointly embark on. It is about pricing carbon, as we were just discussing. It is about standard setting, and it is about creating an environment for our businesses to continue to do business, but do business in a 21st century way that actually respects the planetary boundaries, that respects the way our people want to live, that respects the rules and regulations that come with decent employment. All these things we can put in place together.
ASEAN has been criticized as a talk shop. The EU itself is sometimes seen as over-regulated. So how do we ensure this partnership delivers concrete results rather than more, I can say that, just declarations?
Well, if you look at what we have embarked on today, it's a whole set of extremely concrete actions. And I can only commend also the minister, the climate minister from Malaysia, who made it even more concrete at the end of the meeting, asking for very specific deliverables and get-togethers on carbon pricing, the topic you were asking about as well. That is hugely important. And personally, I think ASEAN is doing a phenomenal job in bringing together the countries in the region. Is it always easy to do things together with a set of countries? Talking about European experience, no, it is not. It's sometimes very complicated. At the same time, it's very much worthwhile because there's so much that we have in common in terms of interests.
Looking at the discussions and commitments made throughout this ASEAN ministerial meeting on the environment, AMME, what would you say the main conclusions we can take away? And how do you see this dialogue influencing not just regional but also global efforts in making climate change and advancing sustainability?
This was a first. It's the very first time that the European Commission and ASEAN have joined forces in such a fundamental way as during this conference. And for me, that is a stepping stone into the future. It provides us with an opportunity to do more in the domain of climate action. But we don't need to limit ourselves to that. In general, if you look at the similarities that we have, the outlook on geopolitics, the outlook on trade, the outlook on more climate action, this is a partnership between the European Union and ASEAN that could, become even more than what it already is today.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights with us today. We truly appreciate your time and valuable perspective. Thank you once again. I'm Khalis Kadir. That's all from us for now. Thank you for watching Pantau Agenda Reformasi. I'm Khalis Kadir. Goodbye.